back to this video series on how to make a villager-style ballet costume. If you missed part 1, I'll link it in the description as well as somewhere on the screen. But in short, I'm replicating this costume that SYB already has in our wardrobe for our upcoming January production of The Snow Queen. If you would like to support that performance and others like it, please consider giving a tax-deductible donation to Spokane Youth Ballet, again, links below. In this video, I'll show you how I made this skirt for the costume. But before I do that, I'd like to make a few clarifications on my previous video. In that video, I said the top skirt was made of cotton voile. And while the skirt I made for this video is in fact made of voile, the one I showed, and in fact all the others like it in our collection, are made of cotton lawn. Like voile, lawn is a lightweight, slightly transparent fabric, but it is also slightly heavier than voile because of its tighter weave. You could use either fabric to make a skirt like this. The reason I went with voile instead of lawn is because when I was searching for fabric online, the swatches I received of voile had a nicer color and weight and were also considerably cheaper than the lawn I could find. Use what works best for your purposes. Since voile is a bit more sheer than lawn, I ended up using 4 yards for this skirt as opposed to the 3.5 in all the others in order to match the level of opacity. In fact, if you look at the bottom of the skirt, you can kind of see how it's more sheer here than it is here. Also, and I don't know if this is just the voile I purchased or if it's a property of voile in general, there's almost a slight sheen to this fabric that you can see under light. I don't think it shows up on camera. That's really, really pretty. Since this is the only skirt I'm making out of voile and it's for our soloist, I'm okay with it being a little different from the others. The second clarification is about the petticoat layers in this skirt. In my previous video, I said there were 4 layers of tulle, but technically there are only 3 full-length layers, which are sewn onto a shorter 4th base layer. You can use as many layers of tulle as you want for your own petticoat, but keep in mind how that will affect the overall shape and movement of the skirt. 3 layers of wide net tulle makes for a really nice, full, fluffy, bell-shaped skirt, as you can see here. With that out of the way, let's get started. To begin, measure and cut your fabric. Like I said, I used 4 yards of cotton voile, but only 3.5 yards of each layer of tulle, so the end result would match the fullness of the skirts I already have. You will also want to cut your waistband at this point. My finished waistband will be 2.5 inches wide, so doubling that and adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side, we get 6 inches. You will want your waistband to be several inches longer than your dancer's actual waist measurement. This is because the skirt is open in the back at the top, and you don't want to see any gap there. If this costume will be worn by multiple dancers, you also want to consider the range of sizes your dancers are likely to be. In a junior company like SYB, our dancers are a variety of heights and sizes, and we want our costumes to be adjustable to any of them. Therefore, I'm making my waistband 36 inches long and could probably have gone a few inches longer. Decide how long you want your skirt to be and cut the fabric to that length plus 1/2 inch. I measured 27 inches in order to make a skirt that falls a couple inches below the knee. If your dancer is particularly tall or particularly short, or if you want a different skirt length, adjust the length of your fabric accordingly. This fabric is very shifty, and I wanted to make sure I cut a straight line, so I used a technique called thread drawing, which means pulling a single thread out of the weave of the fabric all along the length. That's right, a single thread. Yes, this is a tedious and possibly unnecessary process. Yes, the thread will break while you're pulling it, and you will have to find it again before going on. However, the loose weave of the voile makes this an ideal fabric to do this with. When I made the pink skirt shown at the beginning of the video, I did use cotton lawn, and it took me much longer to do this process than it did this time. Personally, I find the time to be worth the result. I'm not sure how visible it is on camera, but you're left with a faint line that you can cut along easily for a perfectly straight edge. The petticoat layers need to be cut at different lengths. Mine are 25, 23, and 21 inches long. Now it's basically impossible to cut tulle in a perfectly straight line because it always warps and stretches. But as long as the end result is straight enough and shorter than the top skirt, it won't matter if it's not perfect, so don't sweat it. Iron all your fabric. Personally, I didn't bother with the tulle since the whole thing will be steamed later, but for the waistband, I like to pre-iron where the seams will be to make it easier to sew it to the skirt. Fold in a ½ inch along each of the 4 sides, then fold the whole thing in half lengthwise and press. I forgot to fold in the short edges of the waistband here, and that caused me some extra work later on. Learn from my mistake. Iron these sides down in advance as well. The next step in the process should be finishing the side edges of the top skirt. I neglected to do that until almost the very end of the project, so I had to navigate around the waistband in the tulle layers when I did this step. Learn from my mistake and save yourself some time. Finish your skirt edges before you attach everything else. Fold the short edge of the fabric twice and iron it before stitching. If you have a rolled hem foot, that would be ideal here. Incidentally, I do have a rolled hem foot, but I don't have enough practice with it to use it very well, so I just used a regular presser foot for this step. Next, run a gathering thread along one edge of the top skirt and each layer of tulle. I used a fairly narrow seam allowance for the top skirt so that the gathering thread would be hidden by the waistband later on. For the tulle layers, I used a ½ inch seam allowance. You can do the gathering stitch by hand or by machine. My machine really doesn't like sewing through tulle, and the thread broke on one of the tulle layers, so in hindsight, I probably should have done these layers by hand. Then, gather each layer down to whatever the length of the waistband is. To do this, I laid down a piece of string the length of my waistband, gathered the fabric until it was even with that, then evened out the gathers. Except, remember how I didn't turn in the short edges of my waistband? That meant I was gathering my skirt layers to 36 inches when I should have been gathering them to 35 inches. Later on, when I finished the edges of the waistband, I had to mush the edges of the skirt in a bit more to accommodate this last ½ inch on either side. Learn from my mistake. Measure to the finished length of your waistband, not the length from raw edge to raw edge. Next, we have to put the petticoat layers together by attaching them to a base layer of tulle. Cut some of your leftover tulle to double the length of your waistband and 10 inches long, or to the same length of your waistband and 20 inches long. We're going to fold this layer in half, so either way is fine. I initially made my base layer just one layer of tulle, but later on I decided that it needed to be a bit more stable, so I added a second layer. Learn from my mistake. Plan for a double thick base layer from the get-go. Then pin and sew all along the perimeter of this rectangle. Next, we're going to stitch some straight lines on the petticoat base. These will serve as guides, so you'll know exactly where to attach each tulle layer, and your petticoat layers will be straight. I sewed my lines 2 inches apart because I cut my tulle to be graduated by 2 inches. However, I sewed my top guideline just 1 inch lower than the seam that will line up with the waistband, because I wanted to make sure my petticoat was a little shorter than the top skirt. Because my seam allowances measured several inches at this point, I taped a tape measure to my machine to serve as my seam guide. I've also seen people create seam guides using lengths of tape at various intervals. Find what works for you. Now that we have a petticoat base and some guide marks, we can attach the tulle layers. Take the shortest tulle layer you cut and line up the gathering thread with the bottom guideline on your base, with the seam allowance at the top. Pin and sew right over your gathering thread. Do the same for the middle layer of tulle, then the longest layer, and you'll be done with the petticoat. Now we're going to assemble the skirt by pinning the waistband, top skirt, and petticoat base together. Make sure the waistband is upside down with the right side facing the top skirt. When pinning the petticoat, the longest layer of tulle should face the top skirt. All your raw edges should line up with each other. Sew these layers together using a ½ inch seam allowance to hide the gathering thread of your top skirt. Remember that the short edges of the waistband should be folded in at this point. If they're not, you'll need to leave a ½ inch of waistband on either side of the skirt layers when you attach it. Again, I didn't do that, so I had to redo part of my waistband later. Learn from my mistake. Tuck those raw edges in before attaching the waistband to the skirt. Then fold the waistband up and over the skirt. See why we did all that ironing earlier? Make sure the inside edge of the waistband is also folded under before pinning it into place, covering the top seam of your petticoat base. The inside edge of the waistband has to be hand-stitched into place to avoid the stitches showing through to the other side. Use a small whip stitch and make sure the needle doesn't poke through to the outer layer of fabric. I always keep a finger on the other side of the fabric to feel for the needle when I'm sewing this way. Anyone who's sewn a few dozen pairs of point shoes should be able to do this pretty easily, but if you haven't sewn a few dozen pairs of point shoes, it just takes a little patience in the beginning to build up speed and confidence. Now we can finish the waistband by sewing the short edges closed. This is done with a ladder stitch, which is practically invisible when the thread is pulled tight. Our skirt is still completely open at the back, so pin the top skirt together, right sides facing, from the hem to a point 10 inches or so down from the waistband. I just eyeballed this. Sew this seam so that the finished edge of the fabric is completely hidden from the outside, then iron the seam open. Note, don't sew the petticoat to the top skirt. It will restrict the movement of the top skirt if it's anchored down in the back. The last thing you'll need to do is attach the closures. I had my dancer try on the skirt at this point and marked where the closures should go. Since she is short-waisted, we made the waistband a little loose on her so the skirt will sit closer to her hips. When there's a good amount of overlap on your waistband like there is here, you really should put a closure on both ends. I didn't film myself sewing the closures, sorry, but here is what they look like when finished. And now we have a completed skirt. Well, almost completed. In part 4, we'll add some simple embellishments to jazz it up a bit. But as far as this video is concerned, we're done. I hope this video was helpful to you, or at least entertaining to watch. Leave a comment if it was, or if you would like to try a similar project yourself. Stay tuned for part 3, where I make a bodice to go with this skirt. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you can be notified when that video is up. Until next time!